everyone, and welcome to Fact or Fiction, the CSI Effect, the show where we will be distinguishing the false representation of forensic science in popular forms of social media. Today we will be going over how crimes are solved, analyzed, and delivered to a jury, and how it's done in real life versus in TV. TV shows everything happens very instantaneously, and that in reality that is just not the case. We are your hosts, McKenna Perry,
Suzette Shear, and Gianna Carducci.
Before we show you some examples, let's talk about what the CSI Effect really is. The CSI Effect is an umbrella term that covers multiple ways in which crime scene television shows impact the way viewers perceive forensic aspects of the cases while also misleading jurors in their expectations during criminal trials. Some of these impacts include influencing jurors to wanting more forensic evidence, the actual role of forensic evidence versus any other forms of evidence that is presented in trials, and the misleading representation of the capability of police and crime scene technicians due to the over-exaggerated crime scene solving abilities that are shown on TV.
Research has shown that due to an increased viewing of crime TV shows, both prosecution and defense attorneys are spending more time in the jury selection process to ensure that they can avoid as much of the CSI effect as possible. Attorneys ask potential jurors questions about their TV habits and educate them about the differences between what they see on TV and what is most likely to happen in a real trial. However, sometimes the prosecution is unable to find a group of unbiased people completely and will instead incorporate more forensic science as needed to better meet the jurors' expectations. This is typically avoided as much as possible because it gives the defense team an opportunity to object due to irrelevant evidence to a case.
When a person watches more and more crime-related TV shows, they are more likely to see forensic evidence as one of the most important things to the trial due to the large amount of evidence viewers see being collected. If a case has less hard evidence, more eyewitness testimonies, or other forms of viable evidence, the prosecution is more likely to dismiss certain jurors, making the process of finding unbiased jurors longer and more difficult.
As the interest in crime-related TV continues to grow, the number of people affected by this phenomenon grows and grows as well. A lot of people are becoming truly interested in forensics in the field of work, but what's shown on TV isn't a reality. TV shows often glorify truly awful acts in order to entice viewers. So the job of a detective or forensic analyst isn't as glamorous as you might think.
To break this down even more, crime-related TV shows are ultimately not 100% accurate. In the real world, when a homicide happens, similar steps are taken, but the producers are trying to make the show more engaging by over-dramatizing it. Today, we are going to be showing an example of a dramatized scene that you might see on TV.
If you look under the fingernails, there's blood. You should get a sample of that. This looks like it was the murder weapon. There's a lot of blood on it. And if you look here, it's like, it shows a lot of signs of bleed. Here, put this in the bag.
Head detective and his assistant enter the crime scene. They are dressed in heels and tight clothes. In reality, this would look a lot different. Crime scene investigators and detectives are normally showing up in baggy clothes, in baggy pants, and clothes that they wouldn't mind getting dirty, also that are suitable for the weather. They're also wearing work boots, and for protection, they're wearing disposable overalls, shoe covers, gloves, and sometimes masks while on the crime scene. All these items help avoid the transfer of DNA at a crime scene. You are very likely to get dirt and chemicals on your clothes along with other substances. So you will also need a lot of mobility to be able to bend down and move around and be able to collect evidence during any crime scene, no matter the location. This can be difficult to do while in fancy clothes.
There are certain steps completed when arriving at a crime scene. Step 1, approach the scene. When first approaching the scene, analysis will receive information from the lead detective or officer in charge of the crime scene.
Step 2, secure and protect the scene. This is when all the evidence found at a crime scene is documented and samples of the evidence are preserved, if found. The crime scene should be blocked off so that only officials have access. It also should be guarded so that none of the public tries to enter.
Step 3, indicate preliminary survey. This indicates a walkthrough of the crime scene with the lead detective or officer. This is when someone tries to establish a path of entry and the exit, while also trying to avoid examining the way the suspect would have entered the crime scene. In this step, you are continuing to preserve the crime scene from contamination.
Step 4, evaluate physical evidence possibilities. This is when it is determined what evidence is likely to be present and look for items hidden on purpose.
Step 5, prepare a narrative for the screen. When preparing a running narrative for the conditions that the crime scene is in, one should consider what should be present at the scene and what's not, and also to look what's out of place.
Step 6, capture the scene photographically. They will start taking photos as soon as possible. Keep track of the photos taken by logging all of the photos, as well as making sure to take the photos using different angles.
Step 7, prepare the crime scene sketch. A diagram should be established at a permanent record of items, like size, relation, and distance. A rough sketch is drawn at the scene.
Step 8, conduct a detailed search. Start to conduct a search in a general manner with specifics that regard to the evidence items. Mark locations on a sketch and complete all evidence logs with correct notations for each piece of evidence. Make sure that all evidence is sealed.
Step 9, release crime scene. The crime scene can only be released after the final survey is complete. Only the person who's in charge of the case should release the information about the crime scene.
Finally, you have to conduct a final survey and release the crime scene. You need to be certain that every package containing physical evidence is collected, leaving nothing behind. Make a final walkthrough to be certain that all potential evidence is bagged and tagged.
We know that the second step to any investigation is securing the crime scene. The slightest breach can alter an investigation and make the investigation not credible or make it a lot more difficult to solve, which is why it is so important to isolate the immediate area of the crime scene. This means securing the entry, possible exit routes, weapons, clothing, and any important evidence.
There are way too many people on the scene of this crime. In the real world, permission is only granted to authorized personnel, and just flashing a badge is not enough to get you in. The severity of a case is the determining factor when you consider how many people need to look at the scene. Most of the time, you see the detective or detectives in some cases, as well as forensic crew along with them. So for a typical case, about 6 to 7 people will be on a scene at one time having different jobs.
One of these many jobs is photographing the scene. Any photos taken at a crime scene must be accurate and unbiased. Forensic photographers must take pictures from every angle to make sure that every inch of the crime scene is recognizable, to make sure that if it needs to be looked at in the future.
Another job is collecting and bagging evidence. In the scene shown, notice no one is taking steps to prevent cross-contamination of evidence. For example, they should be wearing latex gloves, which would help avoid any transfer of DNA. For instance, getting your own fingerprints or DNA on an item of evidence. Mistakes like this can cause a case to be thrown out due to irreliable evidence and the inability to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt.
Not only is nobody wearing gloves, but you can also see the detective bring the weapon very close to her face, which causes for even more transfer of DNA. You can also see carelessness by kicking around evidence. All of these actions will result in deconstruction and contamination of evidence, making it all unavailable to use in court. If the evidence is not properly documented, it could be detrimental to an investigation and potentially damaging during a criminal trial.
You can also see that the detective motions for different things to be bagged while at the scene. In TV, they bagged everything. This is also true in real life. The difference in TV is that everything bagged is used to prosecute a suspect in court, while in reality, all evidence collected at a crime scene cannot be used in court. When collecting evidence, all evidence needs to be documented, photographed, and packaged correctly. When collecting evidence, they need to wear latex gloves, as we mentioned before, and carefully pick up any and all necessary evidence. You can see that the knife with blood on it is placed in a plastic bag in the crime scene shown. If an item is wet and it is placed in a breathable brown paper bag, and only dry evidence can be placed in plastic bags.
On TV, you see lots of yellow evidence markers around the crime scene. To identify possible pieces of evidence, evidence should be photographed and taken to the lab. This leads jurors to believe that forensic evidence is the most important type of evidence, and all the evidence should be used during a trial to prove guilt. However, when the prosecution does not introduce all of the evidence found during a trial, it can lead to confusion for the jurors. This is because of the standards that were made in Hollywood. The expectation that forensic evidence should be the lead of an investigation is blown way out of proportion. If evidence that is collected is irrelevant to a case, does not prove anything, it will be presented. To the eyes of viewer, TV makes forensic evidence the most important type of evidence presented in a trial. In reality, large amounts of hard forensic evidence are rarely brought to the courtroom. Some examples of other types of evidence presented in the court include eyewitness and expert testimonies.
This leads to more cases being acquitted and less criminals being put behind bars, because jurors now hold prosecutors to a higher standard of proof than the traditional beyond reasonable doubt standard, which has led to the acquittal of many perpetrators simply because the evidence collected was not to the jury's standards. One well-known case where this happened was the infamous O.J. Simpson case. While in court, while a crime scene was contaminated by too many paparazzi, too many investigators, and improper evidence collection procedures, the main detective in the case, Mark Furman, was the first to arrive at the scene and took no action to close off the scene, as well as preserve a bloody fingerprint that was found at the scene. There was also an issue when collecting O.J. Simpson's blood. Only 6 milliliters of blood were accounted for by the LAPD, while the person who drew the blood recalls that they had taken around 8 millimeters. It has been reported that some of the main pieces of evidence in the case were accessed and altered by unauthorized personnel, causing even more chaos and confusion within the case.
We'll now move on to the next segment, the lab. In this clip, we'll see our lead investigator get some evidence to the forensic scientist to be processed.
What do you got for me?
23-year-old female, test happens to the abdomen. Alright, the murder weapon was found at the crime scene.
Anything else?
No suspects right now, but it definitely was personal.
Alright. I'll do a fingerprint and blood test, and I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Alright, test results came back, and I got some good news for you.
What'd you find?
The blood belonged to the victim, Jill Goffin. However, the fingerprints matched a woman named Danielle Neal. Records showed that she has an extensive history of anger and road rage, and looks like she used to be married to Jill's current husband.
That's our murderer. Thank you.
In this scene, we see a couple of different things that are just not realistic. First, when the detective walks in, you can see how quickly they went over everything about the scene. The interaction between these two is unrealistic in and of itself. In reality, a detective and the lab technician would never talk in person. They would strictly talk through emails and professional documents, where they would include everything about the case.
In this clip, the detective tossed a bag of evidence across the table, giving it to the lab technician. However, in reality, evidence would never be carelessly thrown. It would be handled with care to ensure that none of the evidence gets damaged, leading to inaccurate analyzation. Also, the lab wouldn't just receive one piece of evidence. They would receive anything of relevance to the case, such as a swab from under the victim's fingernails, pictures or blood splatters, photographs of the positioning of the victim, and anything else of importance. This will help to prove what happened and gather evidence to solve the case and prosecute the suspect.
You can see in one part of the scene, the lab results from testing blood are done. What happens in 5 seconds on the screen actually takes weeks, sometimes months, depending on the backlog of the lab.
The actual testing itself only takes about 72 hours. Within this process, the DNA is taken to a lab and the DNA is extracted from the cells itself. They have to identify how much DNA is present. So then, once this happens, they make copies of the DNA so that there is enough to work with. Then, a gel is prepared which separates the DNA by size. This process is called electrophoresis.
After this process occurs, the DNA is interpreted first by software, then by 2 DNA analysts. Next, a report is written and given back to the agency. After all these steps, the final process can take a minimum of 2 months due to the backlog.
In the scene, the lab technician comes back and has the name of the owner of the DNA, and the case is then solved right then and there. When in real life, this can't happen because there isn't one database that is big enough to hold every person's name and address linked to it. The only time someone is in the database is for specific things such as fingerprints or for other reasons, and they would be in this database because they would have gotten in trouble with the law or had to give it for a job. It isn't just in the database. As we finish off our criticisms of the scene, we would like to thank you for tuning into Fact or Fiction, the CSI effect. It is very important that our audience takes the time to become educated on this topic, as it is one that impacts many different aspects of the criminal justice system.
Since crime TV shows give off false perspectives of how the evidence is collected, processed, and presented to the court, jurors expect more forensic evidence and less circumstantial evidence. When this doesn't happen, sometimes the outcome of the case goes in a different direction than it should, meaning that jurors say someone isn't guilty because there is less forensic evidence compared to what the public thinks is necessary to identify a person of guilty based off crime TV shows.
Thank you so much for watching our show, and we hope that you learned something today.